Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Dr. Stanley Litow, who is a professor at Columbia and Duke University and serves as Innovator in residence at Duke. He's a speaker, writer, and subject matter expert on education and corporate social responsibility, and had a career in the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors, including president of the IBM Foundation, deputy Schools Chancellor for New York City, and founder of Interface. He has served on several presidential commissions and currently serves as a trustee of the State University of New York. He's also a columnist for Barron. Welcome, Stan.
Thank you very much.
So your recent book entitled The Challenge for Business and Society, From Risk to Reward, you discuss the recent federal actions, have altered social and environmental rules, rolling back clean power, consumer protection, and healthy eating initiatives. And you ask, how can responsible businesses step up their efforts to create jobs, reduce poverty, improve education and health, and address climate change issues, both domestically and around the world, while still generating the economic growth to enrich shareholders and create jobs? So the challenge for business and society shows how leaders in business and government can actively balance the growth of business with the needs of society, producing even greater financial returns, you say. So you have always been an advocate of private-public partnerships, having worked on both sides of this equation. How did you become a fan of the private-public partnerships?
Well, I mean, one of the things in my experience at IBM, I had an opportunity to engage in a variety of public-private partnerships to address the challenge of public education or higher ed or workforce development issues, and do them in collaboration and partnership with government. And by no means is it easy, but no one sector of the economy can solve these challenges and problems operating alone. The public sector needs the private sector cooperation. They can't just regulate, they need leadership. And the same is true about civil society, not-for-profit groups. They're desperately needed to bring about real significant change. So cross-sector collaboration and public-private partnerships are vitally important. And that's what I learned in my career high up in the public sector, in the not-for-profit sector, and in the private sector. But one of the reasons I wrote the book, The Challenge for Business and Society, was to look at the American history and say, have there been examples where the private sector actually has led in these areas and really established real progressive leadership, not because they were regulated or legislated to do so. And it's striking to understand that the provision of free health care for all of your employees started at a company called Macy's in 1870.
Mm.
If you worked for the government in 1870, nobody got health care. But if you worked for Macy's, everybody who was an employee of the company did. And the concept of a pension plan in the United States started with American Express in 1875. And
Yeah.
if you worked for a government agency, you didn't get a pension. And by the early 1900s, there were over 500 companies that offered a week of paid vacation. And at that time, if you worked for any one of the state governments in the United States, you didn't even get 1 day of vacation. So I thought if we had that kind of leadership by some companies in some areas, and there are lots of other examples through our history, and that's not to say that there aren't examples of the opposite, of people behaving very poorly, from the
Yeah.
robber barons through Bernie Madoff. But I think there are examples where corporations have really exhibited leadership, and going forward, we need to make that the the rule, not an example. We need to make a higher bar. We need companies to understand it's good for business and good for society, and we need to raise the level of performance.
Yeah. Yeah. But I understand, in a changing regime that we are in today, we see maybe a handful of companies, maybe less than a dozen companies, is really responsible for most of the excess profits in the economy. And with the COVID issue that we currently have, the returns to scale seem to have increased, which would imply that in the future we may end up with a few dozen companies responsible for most of the activity in the economy. And in the presence of lax monopoly laws, we may be in a difficult situation. So even though we have good examples of corporations doing good things in the past, what is your view as to how corporations are behaving today?
Well, I think what we've got today is, I mean, pretty much a window on the past, whether we're talking about 100 years ago or 50 years ago. As you said, there are examples of companies that provide free tuition for their employees to improve their leadership skills and their education skills. We've got a company like AT&T, for example, that instead of laying off all of the workers who work on hardware, they contributed about $250 million a year to reskilling and retraining their workers so that they don't lay them off, that they can then build their skills. So we've got examples of companies that have, strong diversity practices, supply chain practices, environmental practices. But as you say, it's the exception, not the rule.
Yeah.
And the question of how do we get from the examples of a few companies exhibiting real success to making it more common practice and making it something that companies not only agree to do, but try to raise the bar and improve their level of performance. And I think one of the things that we could think about is taking advantage. Virtually every poll says that consumers are more likely to do business with a company that has strong corporate social responsibility practices.
Yeah.
That's what the polls say. And when people are asked, would you prefer to do business with a company that is a good corporate citizen, everybody responds in a very, very positive way. But it's very difficult to take that polling data and turn it into actual practices. And I give you one example. In New York City, former Mayor Bloomberg gave restaurants a letter grade for their cleanliness and environmental practices. So you could walk by a restaurant, and if it was an A, you might want to go in. If it was a C, you might go right past it and not go in. But we might think about a letter grade process that would provide a high grade for companies that had strong environmental practices. progressive labor practices, did all the things that we would hopefully wish all companies would do, and give the kind of recognition to those who do it and lack of recognition to those who don't, and then trust the public to try to exert their action with their wallet to be able to demonstrate that they don't want to do business with a company that has a C or a D in their corporate responsibility. Or if you're recruiting the best top talent, you're going to have a hard time recruiting people with the best technology skills or data skills if your rating is a D or a C minus. So I think, we've got to do more to raise the bar for the level of performance. And it's interesting when you look at the financial practices, there's a lot of data that demonstrates that companies that have strong corporate responsibility practices actually do better economically from an investment standpoint. So I think what we need to do is to think seriously about how do we make this something that isn't just the exceptional example of some companies, and make it the way companies will normally practice. If you look right now at women and minority-owned businesses in the United States, they get about 1% of the supply chain spending of all large companies in the country. If we could get that up to 5% or 10%, you could generate such an enormous amount of investment capital and income into women and minority-owned businesses. You would expand their labor force, you would expand their economic activity, and that would be one clear example of something that people have talked and talked and talked, but we're not making any progress.
Right. And you are involved in education at all levels. So do you think we have an issue with the business school education? When I went to business school, it was a bit like you have a set of structured courses in finance, accounting, marketing, with a couple of ethics and the leadership classes sprinkled in. And the basic message is really to lead a company, you maximize shareholder value, and business school graduates come out, perhaps, I'm just asking the question, I don't know what's happening now, with a false impression that shareholder value can be counted in quarterly statements, and maybe aided by consulting companies and so on, investment banks. Do we have a problem in business school education in general?
I think we have a big problem, and I think it's not only in business schools. I mean, you can take courses in business schools on corporate social responsibility. They tend to be optional. You can take a course on business ethics, tends again to be optional. And ethics is not part of how finance courses or marketing courses or any other business course is taught. But you could apply the same kind of standard to legal education.
Yeah.
You can get your law degree without taking, a real solid framework about ethics and values as they apply to the legal profession or the medical profession. And I really think that ethics needs to be part of how education is taught at all levels. I would start with elementary and secondary education. I would add all higher education, and I would add all graduate degrees. And that doesn't mean that you change the curriculum. Do people need to take a strong, basic set of courses in math or science or English or history? Yes, absolutely. But how that class and course is taught could include examples about ethics. And we also know very much that people who engage in some form of community service activities really have an opportunity to demonstrate their ethics, whether it's an experience like AmeriCorps or the Peace Corps or individual, community service or volunteer activities. They help bring ethical standards into practice. And yet we've had a lot of talk about more focus on community service activities and making it part of the educational experience. And we really haven't made any systemic progress. So what I would say is ethics isn't like an afterthought. It isn't an extra
Yeah.
course that you might take. It's how we should educate people in all levels. We should give people examples to demonstrate through community service. And then when people get into the workplace and companies spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on their employee training and technical assistance and capacity building for their employees, ethics needs to be embedded in that training as well. Not just, do you know what the Foreign and Corrupt Practices Act is, but do you really understand that high level of ethical behavior is part of being an effective worker, manager, executive, CEO, and that's something that's inherent in how you make your living. It's connected to your bottom line.
Right, right. Yeah, I used to think that, ethics and even leadership cannot be taught. And we attempt to do that, I think, in graduate school. I think it's too late, right? The idea of social norms and ethics, if it's part of education, what you're saying, I think, is it has to start really early.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I think when we think about things like, right now we're uh, having a sea changing moment in how people think about racial and ethnic diversity and gender equity and these kinds of things. If they were part and parcel of how you educated people and reinforced it in all levels of education, we might not have the same kind of problems that we're having.
Yeah, yeah. You have an op-ed recently. You say that education must be part of our coronavirus response. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that what we have as a result of COVID-19 is we have a growing and deepening economic crisis. And if we look at the people who have been negatively affected economically by the pandemic, it's overwhelmingly people of color. It's overwhelmingly people with lower education levels, the kinds of jobs that have been threatened, suspended, and now disappearing are the jobs that have, lower education levels. And even in the spite of the pandemic, the areas where the hiring is going to be increasing are going to be places where people have higher levels of education.
Yeah,
That was the case. We talked about a skills crisis even before the pandemic, but I think the pandemic and COVID-19 has intensified that skills crisis. And I think it's going to put an even greater value and importance on providing higher levels of education. And that's where I think, as we think about the industries that have been negatively affected and require some level of financial support from the federal government. And is it fine to support small business? Absolutely. Is it fine to support the airline industry? Absolutely. But the education industry could be at risk as
yeah,
a consequence of the pandemic. And we need to invest and make sure that our education system is strong. And we also need to make sure that people who have been disadvantaged as a consequence of the pandemic do have the opportunity to expand their education skills in this time of crisis. So this is a time to provide incentives for people to get those education and skill enhancements, whether it's provided with a certificate or a degree or an advanced degree, whether it's something that's done while you're not in the workforce or while you're in the workforce. Really, education is critical to economic development and economic enhancement. And I think the pandemic and what is not going to be a V curve, it's going to be a economic problem that's going to be with us for some time. We need to provide the ability for people to improve their education and skills so
yeah.
that they can manage a recovery for themselves.
Right. Right. Then the question would be, what type of education, right? So we have been debating about skills upgrade needed for everybody, with artificial intelligence uh, really taking off, possibly able to do a lot of the routine things that humans used to do. And if we are on this track, it is conceivable that at some point we will reach a position that much of what we call jobs today could be done by machines. And so, if that is in fact true, then there is a real important question: what type of skills, what education, should we be designing for the coming generation?
Well, I think it's true that artificial intelligence is going to change certain jobs, no question about it. It's going to cause disruption and elimination of some jobs. It's also going to lead to the development of new skills and new jobs and new opportunities.
Yeah.
And when people look at the kinds of skills that people need, when the survey of the conference board companies, Fortune 500 companies, the results demonstrated that employers felt that their new hires lacked writing skills.
Mm.
They lacked problem-solving skills. They lacked presentation skills. So a lot of what people are going to need to learn to do and to make it part of their education are the kinds of adaptability skills that will allow people to adapt, change, learn, grow, if the job that they're doing changes. So, I used that example earlier about AT&T of having, a large number of their employees who worked on hardware, and they were expanding the number of jobs that they needed where people had software skills. And they could have laid all those people off and hired others with those skills, or they could have invested in adaptability and training and skill enhancement for those people so that they could grow their skills. And they found that having employees who were loyal and high performers and just needed additional skill level was significant and important. And that investment turned out to be good for the employee, but also good for the company bottom line. So if we think about artificial intelligence and changes in a variety of different ways, if we can have a more adaptable workforce,
Mm-hmm.
I think we're going to be investing in our future. And I think AI will change a lot of the things that are done. On the other hand, there are huge opportunities for growth in fields like healthcare and technology, finance, in a whole host of job categories. And if we have people who have a broader range of skills, if we pay attention to problem solving and adaptability and writing skills and presentation and collaboration, if we can incorporate them in as we change the skill level that people have, I think we're going to have a workforce that will be able to adapt and grow as the workplace changes.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I was reading, the country of Norway, which, has always been on top of the education metrics in the world. They have or is going through a dramatic redesign of the education system. And I found, some of the design principles to be really interesting. So they say students will be familiarized with key social challenges through the introduction of 3 interdisciplinary topics: health and life skills, democracy and citizenship, and sustainable development. And they say several subjects become more practical and exploratory. Critical thinking and critical approach to sources becomes a central part of several subjects. Greater emphasis on play-based learning for the youngest children. Digital skills, programming, and technology will be strengthened. And they say reduction in the number of subject competencies, allowing for more in-depth learning. So this is a structural change the way that they look at education, and given their track record, again, they seem to be leading in these ideas. We are still sort of stuck in a very structured and prescriptive education format. I sometimes think the physics books I used in my university days, my daughter 30 years later used the same books, different edition, but the same book. And 30 years is a long time for us not to change the content or the format of education. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thought is that education, you know, as an industry, is very, very slow to change. I
Yeah.
mean, when you think about, the 180-day school year that was started, back in the agrarian days in the United States and really hasn't changed. We know that you need to adapt and change and grow industries, but think about an industry like education where, you know, uh, we've lived with something so long without thinking about adapting and growing and changing. The way that we have education standards, the way that we test against the standards. So much of education has been resistant to any kind of meaningful change. And
Yeah.
I think that when you're thinking about, you know, preparing people from school to college to career, I think we need to make that experience less siloed and segmented. We need to connect, elementary and secondary to college. It's not just enough to get an increase in high school graduation rates, which we've had in the United States. We need to significantly improve college completion, which we haven't done. And we need to make the transition from higher ed to the workplace more seamless for young people. All of these things will require change.
Yeah.
Um, and, incorporating into how we teach the kinds of things that we call soft skills, but I would really call them essential skills, problem solving, writing, presentation, and really growing somebody who can adapt and change as they go from elementary and secondary to higher ed, and then go from higher ed to career, and really make our education system less siloed and segmented and more comprehensive.
Hmm.
I think is something that's going to build a workforce that is going to be able to adapt and grow and change and develop and be more secure than what we've got. And I think as we look at the impact of technology, that's just one element. I think we really have to figure out, if we've got an industry that is so critical to your economic, fortunes as the right kind of education and skills, we can't possibly think that it doesn't need to change from 1920 to 2020.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, exactly. More tactically, do you think the Zoom schooling that's going on now, do you think that's going to have a lasting impact how schooling is done in the future?
I think it's going to have a huge impact. I mean, I think if we think about what happened in education across the United States is when the pandemic hit and schools started to close in the early to mid part of March, um, without a whole lot of preparation. In elementary and secondary education, people were supposedly learning remotely, but we know that that really hasn't been equitable. We
Yeah.
really know that in some communities, young people didn't have a device of any kind to be able to do remote learning. We also learned that millions of people didn't have Wi-Fi, so they didn't have any connectivity to
Mhm.
access information and materials. And then we also know that some of the material that was available for online learning, not just Zoom, but online learning systems, were not really all that high quality. So we know that large numbers of young people have had their education significantly disrupted. We know that the research tells us that lots of people lose education progress just over the summer months, But if you translate that into a 6-month or a 7-month period without any preparation, you're going to see large numbers of young people who are going to be lagging behind. And then we're going to have to think about how do we get them back up to scale and how we get them moving into the future. And in higher education, we know that while Zoom has permitted some type of courses to continue somewhat like what they used to look like, we know that large numbers of young people are concerned. There was a recent poll that said, almost 2/3 of young people, in higher education nationally are concerned about their ability to stay on time to graduate. We know that their food insecurity has gone up. We know that their mental health problems have increased. We know that substance abuse problems have increased. So it's not just education, it's all these other things that impact on education. So I think the radical, end to in-person learning that happened at all levels of education is something that we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to, and it's going to require investment to be able to make sure that that doesn't produce problems that are with us for decades.
Yeah. And the redesign, I guess, has to take into account emerging technologies too, right? So perhaps even technologies in the area of virtual reality and, things like that. That may open up a huge opportunity, returning to our original theme of public-private partnerships. If you think about how the government and private companies can come together to apply technology more broadly, more systematically in education, it has huge returns, not only for society, but for the companies themselves, because they do have to train a new type of workforce for the future, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I was proud of being able to do while I was at IBM is I created a model for high school education, a 9 through 14 school called PTEC.
Yeah.
It started in New York, in Brooklyn, and now there are about 220 schools across the United States and around the world. And the concept is that students should be able to, over a 6-year period or less, depending upon how they can progress, they ought to be able to earn a high school degree and a community college degree. And their education should include high school classes, college classes, paid internships, mentoring with a professional, the opportunity to really understand all of those important workplace skills, and then be able to either go into the workforce prepared or to go on and get their future degree at a higher level, a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree. If you look at the results of that first school that started in Brooklyn, that President Obama visited in 2013, their college completion rates are 400% higher than the national average. And it's serving a population that is 100% students of color, 100% low-income students. And of the students who have completed their college degree and gone to work for IBM, dozens of them are doing well in the workforce, and they're a population that under normal circumstances, you wouldn't have thought could move into high-wage jobs in the technology sector, because almost 2/3 of them at grade 8 level were more than 2 years behind in reading and math. So, the notion that students can't succeed really gets dispelled by saying that that's not true. Students can succeed, but they need a change in the approach to education. And the public-private partnership here was critical because, without the employer involvement, this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to conclude with your thoughts on, from a policy perspective, if you could make one change in the education arena, what would be the highest priority change from your perspective?
I think the highest priority would be, I would think about rethinking how we train and prepare the quality of our teachers. I mean, I think if you sort of like look at the results, if a student has access to a high quality teacher, they do better than those who don't have access to the high quality instruction. And I think when we think about when we get teachers into the workforce, we invest very little in their continued skill development and in their support. So, teachers need to have access to the right kind of technology skills.
Yeah.
They need to have mentors. They need to have the ability to change and grow their skills. When you think about somebody, coming out of the academy and then being in the workforce, 15 or 20 years, they're going to need continued skill development, and we do precious little of that. So I would put that very, very high on my list, and I'm not sure that would be as divisive as things like charters and choice and vouchers that have been so divisive. I think everybody could agree that we need higher quality teaching, and that's a place where I would put a significant amount of investment.
So you would suggest both changes in credentialing as well as the education of teachers, and there's a hierarchy there, right? So is there sort of a train the trainer type concept that needs to kind of spread through the entire system?
Yeah, I mean, one other example you talked about earlier about AI.
Yeah.
At IBM, we created using artificial intelligence, a teacher tool, Watson Teacher Advisor, that would allow a teacher to be able to go online using artificial intelligence and customize a lesson plan to meet the needs of their class. When you think about a lesson plan, it's developed, and the assumption is every student in the class is actually at the same level, and that this is what the lesson plan is, and this is how you would teach it. But for a teacher, they might have a lesson that they're teaching, and a third of the students are way behind, a third are on grade level, a third are above grade level, and you need to adapt and change the lesson and teach it in different ways. And you might want to get support as you change your teaching strategies. You might want to have people who could help and guide you through that process. And the Watson Teacher Advisor gave teachers the ability to do that for math instruction, grades K through 8. So a teacher could go online and they could get the best lesson plans for a fourth grade math class. They could adapt the lesson, and they could seek help for different teaching strategies and other kinds of things. That's an example of artificial intelligence actually improving the quality of teaching, not replacing teachers. But that's just one small, narrow example. I think that the job of being a teacher is one that I think we should appreciate the difficulty of it, the importance of preparation, the importance of ongoing support. And I think we can think about ways that teachers could get that ongoing skill support and training and in an ongoing way that would improve the quality of instruction, and it would directly lead to improved student achievement.
Right. Yeah, so this has been great, Stan. I really appreciate the time you spend with me, and good luck with everything that you do.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it as well.